All right. Well, just where we left off last time, after talking about social roles with regard to grandparents and a few other changes related to aging, we can talk now about marriage and intimate relationships. So, what we want to think of here is that there are social roles involved in intimate relationships, and these social roles also can transition and change over the course of a lifespan together, perhaps. One theme that I have right at the start here is this transition from instrumental to emotional roles. So, the idea behind instrumental roles means doing things, a bit more active engagement and interaction and doing things together. We can list romantic and sexual partner. And the idea here is that sometimes couples' sexuality declines with age. I have a couple of slides to focus a little bit more on that coming up. Economic partner and domestic partner. So what's entailed here? So an economic partner means here that if both people are working, then what we could be looking at here is income coming from both people as well as managing and balancing each other's lives because of work relationship conflicts and so forth. So with both people contributing income and money to the household and to the relationship, those are instrumental interactions, right? They are means towards an end, right? So of achieving some degree of a financial goal, perhaps. Domestic partners, similar kind of thing. So people living together in the same house now need to um, work together and partner together to maintain the household, right? The cleaning and the upkeep, couldn't say that, and maintenance and all these things that have to be done regarding just the physical environment of the household, right? So that's what I mean by domestic partner here. Likewise with co-parenting, right? What's happening is that if this couple has children, they have to learn how to parent together as a team, right? These are all instrumental roles. But later, as people age, then maybe with retirement, with declines in sexuality, with children grown and become more independent and off on their own, now the roles simplify. And there's a lot less of an instrumental component to the relationship, and it's more now about emotional support and emotional interaction. So we transition into that more of a companion and emotional support role. And even as I mentioned in the previous video, the caregiver role might also become relevant, which, by the way, I should emphasize is an instrumental role as well as an emotional role. But that's one that doesn't necessarily happen to everyone here. So the themes of role simplification, as I said, that's one, right, where the roles maybe there's many instrumental roles when we are younger in our 30s and 40s and married. But when you're older, those we transition away from those, right? The role asymmetry is relevant to a few of these here. Obviously, in one case with the economic situation, if one person is working and the other is not, then one person is providing the monetary support in the relationship. There could also just be large inequalities in the income where one person is maybe making a whole lot more than the other. That kind of asymmetry needs to be balanced. That's a challenge, of course. Um, but when it comes to the caregiver role, once again, asymmetry becomes something here because the person who is ill typically it becomes very dependent on the caregiver, and the caregiver then maybe starts to lose some of the things that their partner used to provide for them, right? So maybe this idea of being able to provide the instrumental support um, disappears once you become chronically ill and you can't do some of the things you used to do. Now the relationship becomes very asymmetrical, where your caregiver partner provides a lot of the instrumental support and emotional support, and you can do a lot less of a lot of those things here. And then there's also the possibility of role exit. This comes up in the case of divorce, of course, but we're not necessarily focusing on that. Um, but I've mentioned in the previous video the topics of spousal passing and becoming a widow or widower. So that's a role exit situation here as well. But again, of course, that comes with retirement, what comes with maybe decline in sexuality. There can possibly be then role exits when it comes to things related to romantic and sexual partners as well. I don't know if this music coming from outside the psych building here is making it into my video, but there's an event happening in the mall today, the Memory Mall. So hopefully that background noise is not affecting anything here. Okay, so I said I had a couple of things on sexuality and aging here, so let's talk about that. So what we're talking about, there's an old term, an old medical term. Maybe I shouldn't use old medical terms. Climacteric. This refers to this idea of a cessation of the reproductive phase of one's life. So after going through puberty and we become sexually mature, we're capable of reproducing. But at some point in life, that may end. And as you would already probably know, this looks very different between females and males. So there is a more clear boundary here that we'll just call menopause for females. So the idea is that what's happening here, there's first a phase called perimenopause where there's some changes that start to happen, and it's a bit of a gradual thing, but then at some point menopause occurs. And at that point, a woman is no longer able to bear children. So here are some of the just general kind of overview stages of what's going on here. We have decline in ovarian follicles. So it's worth pointing out, if you didn't know this already, that when the ovaries develop prenatally, that is, when we are embryos and the reproductive system begins to form, and the ovaries form, and the immature egg cells called oocytes also form prenatally. So that means that all female children are born with the immature egg cells, oocytes, already present in their ovaries, right? That process is called oogenesis, the creation of these egg cells. And that means that oogenesis stops at that phase, and therefore there's a finite number of egg cells present in the ovarian follicles. And then what happens is that at puberty, when the monthly cycle begins, ovulation occurs on a monthly cycle, releasing an egg cell. Then over time, the total population of the egg cells begins to decline and the total number of active follicles begins to decline. So the total number of active follicles and egg cells will influence estrogen levels and progesterone levels because these cycles of these hormones are important for regulating the ovulation cycle and also the menstrual cycle. So these fluctuations start to happen. And then eventually what happens is that estrogen levels will just drop very dramatically. This then triggers the ending of ovulation and also, of course, of menstruation as well. A lot of unpleasant side effects are reported here. So hot flashes, just feeling really hot. Happens a lot at night, causes night sweats. You wake up and your sheets are soaking wet from sweating while you're sleeping and things like that. What's going on here typically is that the hormones like estrogen, they are not just things that are related to the activity of the reproductive system, but they also impact the brain. The hypothalamus is a part of the brain that plays an important role in regulating a lot of hormonal processes in the body. And so because these fluctuations and the drops of estrogen will disrupt the hypothalamus, and one of its other jobs is to regulate things like body temperature. This is why body temperature regulation now gets kind of thrown out of whack. And what can even come with the hot flashes would even be maybe chills as well. And so again, this kind of creates this kind of body temp regulatory problem. Circadian rhythms, likewise, can be disrupted, right? So circadian rhythms being when you're awake and when you go to sleep and when you feel sleepy. So that means trouble sleeping, insomnia, which also then could be associated with some fatigue issues as well. Genitourinary syndrome are things related to changes in the genitals. So things related to maybe some urinary problems and difficulty with sexual intercourse can also become challenging as well. Some pain associated with that, dryness, things of that nature. Maybe even decreased arousal and desire for sex as well. Now, that's not all to say that it's no longer possible for sexual activity past menopause. Of course, that is possible, barring more severe genitourinary syndrome concerns or pain concerns or anything like that. It's just the issue of reproduction, right? Without ovulation, there's no chance of getting pregnant. Now, for men, it looks very different. So referring to an exact climacteric for males is really hard to do, but that there still are processes at work here. So let's try to explore what these processes look like. And it's so there's not a specific age. Like as I mentioned, I didn't say it, but for females, it's going to be generally around the age of 50, give or take a little bit there. And the exact age of onset might be partly genetic and might be also partly connected to a variety of other health kind of comorbidities, right? Other things going on in a person's life. For the males, though, there's no single one thing that we can point to that says, look for this, right? But there's a lot of things that are also going on. So one thing is, again, hormonal changes. So instead of the estrogen, we're going to look at changes in testosterone and gradual declines in testosterone. So in general, testosterone levels decline in almost all men very gradually over the lifespan. The rate of this decline can maybe accelerate a little bit in late adulthood. And this is called hypogonadism. Particularly, we'll call it late onset hypogonadism because there are also juvenile onset cases here as well. But here we're focused just on declines in testosterone levels. It's basically a primary aging effect, right? This is just something that can happen. Again, it's not going to happen the same in all men, so that would then suggest that there's quite a bit of individual variability here. And there have been many cases, as I have noted down here, even men after the age of 80 can actually produce sperm cells and have been known to father children. But other men maybe start to end their sexual activity at some point in their later adulthood years, perhaps because of certain declines in testosterone levels. So what are the side effects of that? Well, one, of course, is just like I mentioned with menopause, decreased arousal, decreased desire and thoughts about sex. There can be other physical changes as well. So testosterone plays a role in muscle as well. So there can be a decline in muscle mass as a result of that, and maybe even some weight gain and increased body fat as well. What we see is that obesity and testosterone kind of have a strong connection with each other. As I have a note at the bottom here, not in the bottom, right in the middle under erectile dysfunction, that obesity kind of body fat kind of converts testosterone into other compounds, and therefore it decreases the effectiveness of testosterone. So that's one thing that can also kind of work to make low testosterone levels kind of worse in a way because it's already declining. But then if you have increases in body fat, then that accelerates kind of the loss of useful testosterone in the body. So it can't do what it would normally do. We can even see mood effects, right? Men with low testosterone can sometimes experience increases in irritability and some mood-related instability, and even decreased motivation to do things. It almost kind of looks like ADHD in some cases, right? Just harder to get yourself to do things and to stay focused and so forth. So, but that's all kind of relevant to just like with estrogen. This is how testosterone affects the brain. Testosterone, of course, plays an important role in the activity of the testes in manufacturing sperm cells. That process is called spermatogenesis. So unlike oogenesis in females, which happens only prenatally when we are starting in the embryonic stage of development, for men it begins at puberty and continues maybe for the rest of one's life. But as I'm noting here, this is going to start to decline. So sperm cell counts and spermatogenesis declines with age. Primarily directly as a function of declines in testosterone levels. So this little statistic that I found, right? So after the age of 80, there are still males who are capable of spermatogenesis, though the number might still be dramatically reduced, but still finding viable live sperm cells in men over the age of 80 is still, a feasible thing. Separate from this, though, of course, is the issue of erectile dysfunction. So with an erection being a critical component of having sex and therefore being related to reproduction, whenever we observe erectile dysfunction, then that would also be something relevant to predicting reproductive issues here. The causes can be numerous, right? So certainly low testosterone, hypogonadism, can also affect erectile quality here and cause problems in that department, but also Blood flow, so atherosclerosis, right? So if you have arterial plaques forming, that means blood flow is not working, and that can also play a big role here as well. Diabetes, specifically here, I'm referencing type 2 diabetes because that's the adult onset diabetes that maybe progressively gets worse, especially if it's not managed very well. One of the many things that can happen with that is that it causes nerve damage. And so then what can happen is that some of the nerves that regulate the reproductive system can be impacted by that, as well as blood flow issues, of course, as well. I already described obesity and what that's going to do to testosterone, and just in general, obesity and erectile dysfunction tend to be correlated and observed to covary with each other. And there's any number of medications. We don't need to go down that long rabbit hole of how many different medications have side effects. Antidepressants is one, but there's a whole long list that can have erectile dysfunction as a side effect. And of course, as someone gets older and maybe has more health concerns and takes more prescription medications, then the risk of these kinds of sexual side effects can also be a larger thing. So what we're describing here is a mix of primary aging effects, right? Like just gradual, slow decline in testosterone levels, but a lot of other secondary aging effects, right? These other health concerns like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, any disease that requires a medication that has the side effects. These are all secondary aging effects, right? They're going to correlate with advanced age, but they're not. They're not. It's but there's still a secondary cause here for the decreased reproductive ability. Final thing to mention here is to talk about the prostate gland. So the prostate gland is an important part of the reproductive system that synthesizes a few compounds that are involved in ejaculation and are components of semen. But in this case, what happens is that as men get older, it begins to increase in size. The exact reason and cause for this is the subject of a lot of active medical research, but nevertheless, a very large percentage of men will experience some degree of prostate enlargement the older they get. And in many cases, even prostate cancer as well. Although prostate enlargement and prostate cancer are separate processes, they both can result in some similar symptoms, which is swelling of the prostate. So benign prostatic hyperplasia, or BPH, is just that, right? It's benign. It's just an increased size. Prostate cancer can cause similar swelling, though an enlargement of the prostate. This by itself is not something that directly affects reproductive ability, I should point out. So even though the prostate does play an important role in the synthesis of seminal fluids, the presence of either BPH or prostate cancer doesn't necessarily impact that directly. So typically then if spermatogenesis is still happening, then all reproductive functions are still normal even in these situations. But the issue here is really with the treatment. So the primary symptom of both of these is maybe some pain, but primarily we're going to see interference with urination. The urethra passes through the middle of the prostate, and as it swells with BPH, for example, it just squeezes on the urethra and makes urination that much more difficult. So older men with these kinds of issues will sometimes find themselves failing to empty their bladder, maybe experience some incontinence issues, maybe having to urinate many, many times throughout the day and waking up in the middle of the night several times to do it because they're not emptying their bladder appropriately. So we have treatments for these things, right? Treatments for both BPH and prostate cancer. And as it turns out, the treatments for either one can lead to varying effects here on reproductive ability. For BPH, there are medications, Flomax, and other things like this that are essentially muscle relaxers that allow urine to flow a little more easily, and other things that influence some hormone levels that might change the rate of enlargement of the prostate directly. These muscle relaxers sometimes result in a side effect called retrograde ejaculation. What happens is that the bladder neck muscles normally close during ejaculation, and if those muscles are so relaxed because of the effect of the Flomax medication, then the semen actually ends up flowing backwards and enters the bladder instead of coming out normally. And so that would obviously interfere with reproductive ability, the failure to have a normal ejaculation. And on top of that, some surgical treatments have a similar side effect. So there's a very common procedure now called green light laser resection of the prostate. So a surgeon uses a laser to resect and reduce the mass of the prostate. Or an older procedure called TURP, which is transurethral electronic something or other. I don't know the whole name of it there. I'm not a urologist, so we don't need to get into all those details. But it uses a similar technique to just try to shrink the size of the prostate from inside the urethra. Both of these procedures very commonly also result in retrograde ejaculation. So again, that's going to result in some challenges with reproduction. Surgeries to remove the prostate, especially in the case of prostate cancer, carry a greater risk of causing some nerve damage. And so what happens here is that damage to some of those important nerves around the reproductive tract down there will cause maybe erectile dysfunction at that point. That's something that is somewhat commonly observed as well here. Sometimes another side effect is what's called anejaculation. So that means then that rather than retrograde ejaculation, the idea is that the fluids are just not being produced at all anymore, and so there's no more ejaculation. So in all of these various cases, across all of this, we see that there's a large variation then in the total number of possible things that can be happening with male sexuality with age. These all occur, as I said, to varying degrees between individuals, and therefore the extent to which any one person is impacted by them will vary quite a bit. So that is contrasted on the previous slide here with menopause, which is a lot more uniform. Obviously, everyone has their own unique experiences with how things go when it comes to menopause, and the age can vary a little bit, but it's a much more clear-cut process here than what might be going on with males. But all of that said, we also want to talk about healthy sexual aging because many older adults still continue to have sex, and as you may have heard, there are places in retirement communities and communities for older adults where maybe people are having a lot of sex, and maybe the rates of sexually transmitted infections are high in some of those regions. And it turns out it's true, right? I have some statistics here that about half of men and a little less than half of women, at least between the ages of 65 and 74, report being sexually active. So that's a pretty reasonable number, I think. And there's lots of good reasons for why people would want to still have sex, right? Because people enjoy it. And therefore, there's actually a lot of benefits to having healthy sexual functioning when we get older. So all of these things that impact reproduction can also have an effect on our overall quality of life as well, and just overall sexual functioning here. So yeah, it's a form of physical activity. So of course there's some cardio benefit perhaps from all of that. Mental health benefits, right? The fact that the fact that you can still do it in a way, right? So that you feel that it's pleasurable, and doing things that are pleasurable and feeling like you can still do things. Maybe it's a boost to your self-esteem that you can still engage in this activity at a certain age. Of course, also the emotional side of things as well, right? So having a close connection to someone and having that kind of intimacy with them brings an emotional component as well, and that's an important part of our the social side of aging. So there's lots of reasons that we want to encourage healthy sexuality in aging. We do need to worry maybe a little about those STI rates, though. So maybe a little safe sex practices are also relevant for aging as well. Okay, so next thing up here is the retirement role. I just want to preview where we are here. Let's do the retirement role, and maybe we'll wrap up this video. We'll break this into 3 videos here. Since we're talking about social roles, we've got grandparent roles, we've got marriage and intimate relationships and sexuality, and now we have the retiree. So what are our expectations for retirees? So again, there's this idea that people will have an increase in their leisure time, right? I mentioned this when talking about grandparents. And so now people are going to transition away from having to go to work where you're doing things for other people, what your boss tells you to do. Now you have more time for yourself and you're going to do things for your own personal enrichment, more leisure, less work, right? Um, People are also expected to try to maintain their health, right? So there's the expectation that you should try to be healthy and still maintain and try to live as long as you can. Um, there may be expectations that you become more involved with your family, right? When you're working full time, it can be harder to do that. There's a lot of research on work family conflicts. So now maybe you should have more time for your family. Although, of course, what comes now is maybe reduced economic productivity. Right now that you are no longer bringing home a regular paycheck, there's maybe the expectation that you spend less. And that means you also have to plan for your retirement. So that's the idea of financial stewardship, that people are expected throughout the course of their working years to appropriately save so that they have retirements to draw from, have a pension or some sort of investment. Um, but also, even after they retire, that they then start to manage their money a little better, right? Living on a fixed income is the usual phrase here. Um, Maybe our daily routines also change as well, right? So I don't have to get up and go to work anymore. So what am I doing with myself in the morning? And what's my new routine? So there's adaptations here as well. I've already covered things related to the way our identity changes, right, with the identity assimilation and accommodation, but that's still a relevant point here. And maybe even we have to form new social groups because the coworkers that we were around for many years are no longer part of our usual regular social group. So now with new leisure activities, uh, maybe we form new social groups here, right? But as noted before, these might all be stereotypes, right? These social roles are ways we might expect people to act, but that's not going to look the same for everybody. And it's certainly going to vary as a function of a lot of stuff here. So this is where role strain becomes an issue here. Role strain refers to a form of conflict between the idea that I might think if I'm the retiree that I'm supposed to engage in XYZ, right? Any of the number of things on this list, but you know, if my health status isn't so great, then am I really able to have an increased amount of family involvement? Am I really able to have more leisure activities? Um, if I don't feel healthy. So maybe I feel like I'm not able to live up to my expected role as a retiree. Again, with the economic SES business, right? Maybe if I don't feel like I have the money to be involved in extra leisure activities and personal enrichment, then it's harder for me to do that. What about social isolation and disengagement? Well, um, this is the idea that there's a couple of things going on. One is that if we have some degree of decline in our mobility, we might get out of the house just a little less often. So therefore, we have social interactions with other people a little less often. And on top of that, because we might be retired, then we don't see our coworkers anymore. So that social group is out of the picture. But have I effectively been able to form a new social group? So now I have fewer friends, fewer social interactions. It's harder to meet new people and find new friends at this point. So we start to become a little more socially disengaged at this point. And it's also worth pointing out something that's a darker side of aging here that we don't think about too much, but technically speaking, the longer you live, the more likely it is you are outliving people that you were once close to, right? Your friends, family members, right? You start to outlive them. And so the total number of those people who are involved in your life just declines, right? Um, and so that's part of the disengagement process is just gradually losing your social network bit by bit. Um, Role identities, right? So having trouble transitioning out of certain role identities and adapting to that. And even age discrimination. Let's think about this for a second. Um, the idea here is that, maybe when it comes to economic productivity, maybe I want a part-time job, right? I've retired from my main career, but certainly I think it would be nice if I could go somewhere and work a few hours and make a little bit of money to supplement my retirement income. but nobody wants to hire me. And why is that? Is it because I'm older? Is it because they might think that because I'm older, I won't be as productive as a younger worker, or maybe they think that I won't be that I'm too out of touch with something. All these things we were talking about negative stereotypes before, that I won't be able to use technology on the job, um, that maybe I'm going to expect a higher pay because of my age and status and so forth. And so they might just choose to hire younger people instead of older people because of that, right? It might even show up in leisure activities, that because we might have stereotypes about older adults being frail, that it might be harder for older adults to get involved in some leisure activities that might be a little more physical in nature because they might be discouraged from participating in various ways. So there's all these reasons why then that what we're going to say is that retirement does not look the same for everyone. That's what I have at the bottom when I say that retirement is heterogeneous. We can have expectations, we can have social roles in terms of what we stereotype retirement is going to be, but in reality, it is quite heterogeneous. That means it is quite variable, right? And one way to think about that heterogeneity is through these two views of retirement here, the idealized versus the constrained, right? So the active, engaged grandparent that we were talking about, right? That is able to travel, to engage in leisure time activities and hobbies and volunteer and do things for personal enrichment. Sure, but they might also have limited mobility and not be able to get out of the house. So they have constraints, and that's going to maybe make it harder to do all of those kinds of things that we think older adults can do. The idealized retiree has a massive savings and Social Security and a pension and all this stuff to rely on to cover them through their retirement years, but the constrained person might not have those things and therefore has very limited options when it comes to income, fixed income, may have to try to struggle to continue to keep on working past the point where they really are able to work anymore. The idealized retirement is one that has rich social interactions and the person remains socially engaged, whereas the other one is more isolated and has fewer opportunities and feels excluded from many social environments. The idealized retiree may be independent and active, right? Able to do all of the ADLs and IADLs, but we also might have some concern over our identities changing, right? So rather than feeling like I can still do all of the same things that I used to do, now my identity is one where I have accommodated and I've felt that I'm no longer the person that I used to be. My relationships are not the same anymore. Maybe now I'm dependent on others, or maybe I'm a caregiver. So now someone is very dependent on me, and that places a lot of constraints on what I can do because I'm not free to just be gone for the day while I'm engaged in some leisure activity if my spouse is at home and needs me for hourly care, right? So those are significant concerns here that influence one's social roles as a retiree. It's also possible that in some cases, older adults simply feel like they are ignored, right? That they are just no longer part of society. They feel invisible. Uh, and so again, it's harder to be more active and engaged with the world if you feel that you don't feel welcome in the broader world because of your age. And again, the idea of the leisurely and self-enriched experiences here can be constrained by my role conflicts and stress and self-esteem issues and frustrations. All these things have come together here that will influence how we actually experience retirement versus as I have over here, maybe what the social expectations of the retirement role are, may look very different in reality here. Um, okay, so actually, you know what? Let's finish this up. There's just 2 slides left, so let's get this video done here. I was just mentioning that the longer we live, the more likely it is that we are going to outlive our friends and our family. And not a great thought to have here, but technically it really is the case. And so we'll call this social disengagement, right? It's the narrowing of our social world that comes from those kinds of losses. And so that's our first list. There's actually many cases, many reasons this occurs. And so the first one I've listed there is just outliving other people. But again, I also had described earlier issues of mobility, right? If we're just not able to get out of the house as much anymore, then because of these limitations, we're just going to interact with others a little bit less. Some of that might be mobility, right? If I'm having trouble walking, if I'm at risk of falling, or if I just can't physically operate my car anymore or anything like that, or even if I have public transportation to rely on, but I have trouble getting in and out of a bus or subway or whatever it might be, then again, there's going to be mobility concerns. But even some of the sensory stuff, right? So when we talked about visual changes, right, a lot of visual declines might make it harder for people to function in the world if they're having trouble seeing. So they might, again, start to restrict themselves from having interactions with others. They get tired easy. So again, so maybe we just have to limit what our activities are. Sometimes because of various cognitive declines, right? A lot of the memory related things that I've described here. What can be going on here is that sometimes people again will self-withdraw. They simply just say, I'm going to try to avoid others. Sometimes it might even be like something because of embarrassment, right? They start to realize some of the ways in which they're not able to function as well as other people, and this causes some degree of embarrassment and shame. So they hide it by maybe managing their interactions and restricting their interactions with other people. I've already described what comes with the loss of our workplace social network, so let's move on past that here. I mentioned in the previous video geographic separation, right? So once your kids grow up and if they move really far away and you're still in your same hometown, maybe, you know, maybe many important members of your family now are just pretty far away. So again, of course, you're going to physically interact with them a lot less. Income issues, again, remain pretty relevant here as well. And as I already described, again, caregiving responsibilities. So if I have someone at home that I really need to care for, and they might need daily care, maybe all throughout the day, every couple of hours, they need some assistance and some check-ins. You can't just go off and leave them alone, right? So those caregiving responsibilities also then influence our abilities to maintain an active social life with other people outside of the home. So a long list of things that is by no means complete and comprehensive here can provide some picture here of what social aging can look like. And so we need to be mindful of that because of the concern over loneliness. And loneliness here is defined as a subjective feeling of social disconnection. And that's critical because it doesn't mean that you are necessarily actually literally alone. Obviously, we might expect that a person, an older adult who lives by themselves, actually alone, one person in a house, could feel loneliness. But sometimes a person who lives in a house with a spouse might also feel lonely because of changes in the relationship with the spouse. Maybe it is because of a caregiver, caregivee kind of a situation, or maybe it's something else altogether, but because of changes in that relationship, there may be some feeling of loneliness here. Or even if it's not just the spouse's fault, right? If it's not just some deterioration in that relationship, but just because they just don't get out of the house very much, the feeling of only being around one person instead of being around lots of other people the way maybe your life used to be like could also cause a subjective experience of loneliness. And by the way, it's also worth pointing out that sometimes a person who lives alone does not feel lonely, right? So it's not really about how many people you're around on a day-to-day basis. It's more of a subjective feeling of how connected you feel to others. And so whether you feel that connection or not, that's what's really going to be important here for your feelings of loneliness. But I have some stats, and so we see that as much as a third of older adults could report some feelings of loneliness. Usually, these kinds of questionnaires are asking things like, how many of these feelings have you experienced in the last 6 months? And that's what we're going to kind of label as kind of frequent loneliness here. One of the things that we see is that not only is this something of a negative quality of life and a negative emotional state concern, but there's also health concerns associated with this as well. There's plenty of data coming from health psychology researchers that shows that people who have a stronger and more emotionally close social network experience better health outcomes. And a lot of this is attributed to what is called the stress buffering hypothesis. So, as it turns out, having a strong social connection to others and having a good close knit social network helps us manage our stress. Our friends actually relieve stress. And stress causes illness. And we don't need to go down this rabbit hole of all of the many different ways in which stress can cause inflammation and cause illness, but it does. And therefore, all of those kinds of stress related illnesses are going to be at an increased risk for people who don't have that social support. And that means things like cardiovascular disease. Yes, in fact, that is true. That stress causes that. And people with better friend networks have less stress and therefore less risk of cardiovascular disease, longer lifespans, so therefore reduced mortality, and also things related to mental health outcomes and quality of life here, depression and anxiety. We have other chapters on the mental health stuff later, so I'll save that for then. So, what are the protective factors here? How can we ward off some of this stuff? Well, obviously, the existence of organizations and clubs that are dedicated to older adults, right? So we want things that are more accepting of older adults. I talked about the possibility of exclusion from leisure activities before, but there are many organizations that are dedicated exactly to that. But you need a variety here because, the exclusion factor is pretty important because if there's something that you really are interested in doing as a leisure activity, as a retiree, but it's typically the kind of activity that is done by younger adults, then it might still be harder to get into those things, get into those activities and organizations. So, there's still challenges and roadblocks here, but the existence of some variety of opportunities like this for older adults is going to be pretty critically important. Not to mention things related to mobility assistance. One thing at the least is that we do have an increased kind of transportation options with ride-sharing services these days. So at least that's one possibility to help people get out of the house even when they can't drive anymore. The last thing to question is whether or not technology can serve a role here. So having relationships with people through media, through telephones, social media, the internet, these are called mediated interactions. And well, it raises, of course, the question of whether or not a mediated interaction like that is as good as the unmediated face-to-face in-person kind of stuff. This may depend a lot on the person themselves, of course, and the kind of expectations they have for friendship and interaction. But for certainly for many people, it can be good enough. And so the existence of social media might play an important role in helping people kind of cope with this, right? So they maybe they don't get out of the house, but they go online and they interact with others online, and that can be a good way to cope with their social disconnection. They feel connected to others in that environment. We might also ask whether there are other technological interventions, such as whether AI, right? So there are chatbots and there are digital personal assistants like Amazon's Echo Alexa device. And you can talk to them, right? You can type and talk to them like the way you do with an AI LLM, but you can also get the apps where you can just talk directly to it. It talks back to you, and so that kind of interaction is certainly not a real social interaction. We might call that a parasocial interaction. But nevertheless, people develop parasocial relationships with others. And is it possible that one can develop a parasocial relationship with these kinds of devices and AIs? Yes, absolutely. In fact, there's already plenty of evidence we see it happening, not necessarily with older adults, but there's plenty of cases popping up now in the news of people forming, in some cases, problematic parasocial relationships, but not necessarily always problematic. And then what about robots? Can we have robot friends here? I have a picture here of Misty. Misty is a robot that we have tested here at UCF, and we've tried to look at different ways in which Misty might be perceived by older adults, especially, right? So this is part of a broad area of human technology research called technology acceptance, right? Are people likely to accept such a technology and use it? Um, would they adopt it but then abandon it maybe, right? This is called the dresser drawer effect. You get some fancy new electronic gadget and it seems cool at first, but then you get bored with it and you put it away and you never use it again. This was what happened with Fitbits and similar kinds of wearable health technologies a few years ago. So we want to understand how people perceive and understand and connect to these kinds of devices. Do they, what do they expect them to do? What kinds of behaviors, what kinds of interactions um, do they expect? And if the device is able to perform those kinds of things, does this improve their sense of a social connection to it? If the Misty robot or any of these other platforms um, fails to meet those things, do we then start to mistrust or distrust these technologies and fail and then not adopt them, not use them? These are the questions, of course, that are part of what's called human factor psychology. That's we do a lot of that here at UCF to look at human technology interactions of that sort. So that, at best I can say right now is that there's maybe some degree of promise. Obviously, these technologies are in many cases emerging, so their quality is better than it was, but maybe still needs to improve quite a bit before people are maybe increasingly likely to adopt and use. Whether it can ever serve as a true social companion that will solve the problem of loneliness remains to be seen. But nevertheless, at least becomes a tool on the horizon here that we can think about. Okay, I think we have now covered it all, haven't we? Yes, we have. So we are now done with that chapter. So we will call it here and see you next time.